Welcome back to Farage. The pubs will soon be shut down anyway, so we're conducting Talking Points virtually. And with me is Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army, Chief of the General Staff. It doesn't really have as cute an acronym as it used to do in the days when they were known as SIGs for old school imperialists like me, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. They need a vowel in the less imperial title. But we're glad that Lord Dannatt could join us. And while we're imperially messing about, let me just ask you a bit about Afghanistan, because you were involved in that very much in the early years of the thankless unwon wars of the 21st century. And after the fiasco, which I think it was, at least as far as America's enemies were concerned, there was a lot of the commentary was that, oh, well, it was fatalistic. Oh, well, this is Afghanistan, graveyard of empire, ask the British, ask the Russians. In other words, that this was destined to be the way it was. You knew those early years very well, including on the ground. Did it have to end this way?
No, it didn't have to end that way at all. I think the great sadness, the tragedy of what had been worked really hard on in the 20 years since 9/11 was that Afghan civil society had really begun to make progress. If that was not the case, why would there be 270 female judges, for example, in Afghanistan? No, the real tragedy is that Donald Trump decided that he wanted to get America out of its forever war. Joe Biden campaigned on that, and ending the forever war was a bit of a bumper sticker. And he converted a bumper sticker into a policy. And then lo and behold, this August, they pulled the plug. And the real tragedy is that the very small international force that was still in Afghanistan and hadn't lost a soldier killed in action for 18 months was supporting the Afghan security forces. They were containing the Taliban. And meanwhile, Afghan civil society was improving and growing all the time. And all that was swept away on the whim of President Biden, honouring the agreement that Donald Trump had made with the Taliban back early last year. And that's the real tragedy. And of course, it's a real tragedy for the people of Afghanistan now. 22, 23 million people there, most of whom are on the breadline, starving, and it just did not need to be like that. A real opportunity to do something good in the world was wasted. Joe Biden will he'll struggle to go anywhere upwards in my estimation.
Well, as you pointed out, there's a kind of bipartisan antipathy and indifference to these wars. It's very hard to conduct a long-term war when the people back home just shrug and give up on it and regard it as a downer, and they don't want it in their news bulletins anymore. You dealt with this in a certain sense as Chief of the General Staff, because you were very concerned that you should be known, your face should be known, you should be out there interacting in the media. But if the public just say, nah, this is like a movie that's gone on too long, I'm bored, see what else is on, what do you do about that?
Well, you put your finger on a very real problem, and we've seen it in many campaigns, not just British campaigns, but the Vietnam War, for example, the United States. When the public at home loses interest and loses support in the campaign that the military is conducting, that's a really major factor which plays on governments' minds, which decides for them that they want to bring this to a conclusion. And of course, these counterinsurgency operations are all about people. They're not about winning or losing. They're all about persuading the population in a given country. And I seen it in Bosnia, I've seen it in Kosovo, we've seen it in Iraq and Afghanistan, that actually they want to follow a certain course of action. And that's what you have to play to the internal media in the country in which you're operating. But then the other audience is the audience back home, to make sure that the audience back home, people in this country, in the United Kingdom, still support the campaign that's going on. And those are the two things that governments really have to keep in mind. Winning the campaign, the hearts and minds, if you like, of the people in the country in which you're operating, but also maintaining the support of the people back home to say, well, actually, this is worth doing. And although we're taking some casualties, in Iraq, we lost 179 of our people. In Afghanistan, 457. That's a huge price to pay. But in fact, a lot was being achieved and could still well have been achieved if President Biden hadn't swept that away in August this year.
Do you think that has damaged the credibility of the United States with serious foreign actors, by which I mean China, who are reported already to be poking around Bagram Air Base, for example? Do you think that China, Russia, the Iranians look on America as a paper tiger? It accounts for 40% of global military spending, but it's managed to hand Afghanistan back to the Taliban with more territory than they had 20 years ago. Is there a credibility issue there?
I think you've got it in one there, and I think the West is standing in danger and has stood in danger for quite some time with weak leadership from the United States. It started with Barack Obama, who said he wanted to be the president that would end wars, not start them. That's a noble desire. Continued with Donald Trump, who frankly no one really quite knew what he was on about. And Joe Biden, well, I've already talked about Joe Biden. But what the West needs is strong leadership from the United States. And what Vladimir Putin has seen is that the West is pretty weak. So he's pushing in Ukraine, he's pushing up in the Baltics. What China is seeing is that America is lacking in leadership. So they're pushing in Hong Kong, they're pushing in Taiwan, and Iran on the nuclear deal. Are they really worried about us taking further action? No, they're not. The West is standing in danger at the present moment. And part of that, the significant part of that danger is that we're not seeing sufficient leadership from the United States to lead the Western world in a strong and determined fashion, not to dominate other people, but just to defend our own values, our own territory, our own way of life from threats such as from Russia, from China, and from Iran.
Well, we shouldn't just beat up on US presidents. Your book was fairly excoriating of the political leadership in Downing Street in the early years of these wars. They're seen perhaps by the public as Tony Blair's wars, certainly Iraq is. It was Gordon Brown by the time you became head of the army. What is the role for a second-rank power such as the United Kingdom? Is it just to follow the Americans into whatever quote-unquote NATO mission they decide to go for? Or is there a meaningful independent role for the British Armed Forces?
Oh, well, you asked two questions there, and your last comment changes it slightly. Is there a role for the United Kingdom? Well, the answer is yes, there is a role for the United Kingdom. Because don't forget, as I'm sure you're not, that the United Kingdom is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. That's a huge responsibility placed on us. And of course, we're a member of the G7, we're a member of the G20, and within the British dominated part of the world, not dominated is the wrong word, we are the leading nation within the Commonwealth. So the UK has a strong leadership role, and when you've got a strong leadership role, you have responsibilities, and we need to discharge those responsibilities in a sensible fashion, which means that we need to seek influence in the world. We can seek influence through our diplomatic skills, they're widely recognized. We can seek influence through our military capabilities, which are not as strong as they were, not as strong as they should be, and also the focused use of our development budget. And again, I'm one of those who opposes the fact that we've cut our overseas development budget from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%. And that's the wrong thing to have done. I know there's a pandemic, and I know that the Chancellor has got to find lots of money for other really important things. But actually, if Global Britain, which is what Boris and others actually want to make a reality of, we've got to have influence through our diplomatic skills, our military capability, and also through the focused use of a decent amount of international aid. Then Britain can have a role in the world, can be Global Britain, and do something really useful. That's something to celebrate, something to work for, and not something to be embarrassed about.
Well, you mentioned the Commonwealth just now. You presided over what I think was the biggest British military exercise since the end of the Cold War 30 years ago at the British training base. It's a bit of a misnomer to call it a base because it's kind of like as big as some countries in Canada. Do you think those Commonwealth and I was always told by friends who joined the Canadian or the Australian military or whatever that there were very real and meaningful relationships between the various of the Queen's armies. Do you think those relationships are still real and active today? I mean, they're not alliances. They're not like NATO in a sense because they're assumed to be family. So they just are. Is that still a thing these days?
Very much so. Our military relationships with a large number of countries, and certainly some of our European partners, our military-to-military relationship with the French and with the Germans and with the Italians actually is very good. But it's very special with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and a number of the Caribbean countries. All those countries that have been part of, well, previously the British Empire, previously were colonies of ours, but now we're all equal partners within the Commonwealth. There's a very special relationship there. When I was Commander of British Forces in Bosnia in the mid-90s, I had Kiwi Company under command, 120 New Zealanders, who were fantastic soldiers, and they were really pleased and proud to be part of the international force that the UK was part of. And you mentioned Canada. We've been training in Canada since 1972 on a huge part of the prairies, which most of the armoured warfare expertise the British Army has gained over the last 50 years has come from the prairies in Alberta. So our relationships are very good, and we enjoy those relationships. And I think that's something to be celebrated.
Well, thank you for that. I think that will be reassuring to a lot of people, Lord Dannatt. And thank you very much for sharing your insights. Yeah, you want to say one more thing? Go ahead.
I was a guest at the Adelaide Test match in 2006, and the chairman of the cricket club in the lunch interval said, "I'd like to welcome our guests. I'd like to welcome General Sir Richard Dannatt, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff." Well, if the Aussies wanted to consider me still Chief of the Imperial General Staff, crack on, I thought. I don't mind at all.
Well,
just to go back to your opening comment.
Yeah, and I think we let's just for the sake of those people in Adelaide, let's go back to that title. Thank you to the former Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lord Dannatt. Yeah, you shouldn't be so shy about these titles, folks. Let's get it back out there. Come on, Boris.